Hello and welcome to Unacademy, the one-stop solution for English medium UPSC Civil Services aspirant. Today I welcome you all to the Hindu analysis, and we have very interesting topics to cover today. One from world history itself, where we'll try to understand the static portion also, and this is going to be a feature where we try to bring in a lot of static with current affairs also. But before we begin, a very important announcement for you, which is the subscription for Unacademy 15 months is available at 24999. This is one of the lowest prices we have ever offered, and you can join the English batch on 8 June, and you can call this number, or the link to join this course has been given in the description box. And I hope that you will become a part of the Unacademy family if you've ever considered us as a way of your preparation and generally constructively contributing to your UPSC journey. So remember that this offer price is a limited period offer and will not remain for a very long time. With this, let's look at the 7 topics we have to cover. First is that there's an anniversary of what is called as the Battle of Normandy or D-Day. We'll talk about this first, related to GS paper 1. Then we'll talk about a very interesting article about redemocratization, the concept of how this elections has a larger implication for India itself, for GS paper 2. Then we'll talk about a very psychological based understanding of air pollution, where there's a new initiative which is trying to give visibility to something which is invisible. Then we'll move to the fight of India against TB and why there is a need to reimagine that. Then we'll talk about the implications of the elections on the FTAs and what is going to happen in the larger trade sector itself. Then we'll go to gene therapy related to science and technology. And last but not the least, a very important milestone touched by one of the Russian cosmonauts, 1,000 years or 1,000 days in space. So with this, let's start our discussion. And the first one is these iconic images which have now become 80 years old. This is the image of the beaches of Normandy in France. And today is 6th June 2024, which marks 80 years of the moment on 6th June 1944, when the Allied powers tried to take back Europe. So the Battle of Normandy is considered a very, very important moment in the story of the Second World War. And what we'll try to do is we'll try to contextualize everything, and Normandy cannot just be understood vis-a-vis itself in isolation, and we need to understand it in the larger context of the Second World War, where we try to understand what is Blitzkrieg, what is the Second World War, what were the reasons for that. So there's a lot of politics which is happening in and around the memorial of Normandy itself, because Russia has not been called for. So we'll talk about this, which is the current geopolitical implications of something like this. But in order to understand that, you need to know what is the importance of Normandy in the larger story. Now, if you have done your world history, you would know that the Second World War was based on multiple causes, but specifically because of the First World War and the Treaty of Versailles. So the Treaty of Versailles did not do justice with Germany generally, one of the most humiliating treaties which was used by Hitler, and because there was a sense of revenge within Germany, that was used by Hitler to Aryanize the country itself and therefore create the context in which somebody like him could become the Führer or the leader. The same is true for Italy, where Mussolini is going to use the fact that Treaty of Versailles did not give a lot of promised lands which were promised to Italy vis-a-vis the Trino Triste area or even the Aegean Islands which were promised to Italy. So there is also discontent in Italy with regards to the Treaty of Versailles and the First World War. And the idea is both these fascists, as they're called, anti-socialist, ultra-nationalists, they use this sense of revenge to come to power. One is the impact of Treaty of Versailles. The other is the general disdain and distaste for democracy in both these countries at this point of time. Just to show you the map of Europe at this point of time, Italy and Germany become what we call as Axis powers or fascist countries because of their experience of the First World War. And over and above that, there is an idea that democracy is useless because they had proportional representation which gave them very unstable governments, and therefore both had an inclination to go towards big leaders, authoritarian leaders or charismatic leaders in that regard. At the same point of time, there's also by England and France what is called as the policy of appeasement followed. The policy of appeasement is the English and the French realizing that we were too harsh, in the First World War itself, in the Treaty of Versailles. And Chamberlain, who was the Prime Minister of England at this point of time, personifies this idea where he allowed Hitler to do a lot of things which should not have been done. So the idea is both Italy and Germany had their own causes, and Germany much more, to basically hate the West, and there's an anti-West idea. Over and above that, they also hate a concept wherein you have the USSR on the eastern sector. USSR at this point of time represents a certain ideology which is socialism or communism, which is in itself anti-capitalist, and the capitalists in Germany and Italy actually recruit Hitler and Mussolini in a way. A lot of money for Porsche, BMW, or you take Mercedes or Boeing, all these different companies, Boeing for the English, but Mercedes cars and Mercedes trucks were used by Germany quite a lot. So German money which went into the Nazi program itself was all capitalist money, and therefore they were trying to protect against socialism. So therefore that is why fascists in the 1940s had a very, very specific, 1930s and 40s, had a very specific anti-socialist agenda. Now once Hitler is able to consolidate power by 1933 through what is called the Reichstag fire, in which he is going to burn the parliament of Germany in the pretext of basically asking his SA and the SS, which is Sturm ab der Lohm and the Sturmstaffel, to basically burn it, and then argue that it was the communist, it was the Jew who actually burnt the temple of democracy in Germany. That is the context in which Hitler is going to consolidate power and then become the dictator of Germany. Now from that point forward, Germany now pursues an expansionary ideology, which is called, again, very standard discussions which we do in class, which is called Lebensraum. Lebensraum is the concept of living space, which is Germany was feeling concised within the space which was given to it in the First World War itself, and therefore Germany wanted to break free, wanted living space. And again, the timeline of this is very interesting. First, it starts with Czechoslovakia. I'll change the color of the pen so that you can see this. It starts with Czechoslovakia and the issue of what is called as Sunderland. Here it only shows Slovakia because it's the map of 1939. In 1938-37, Hitler starts the concept of that we need to save the Germans in Czechoslovakia, Sunderland. He had already taken Austria. Now he moves to Sunderland, and then he takes Czechoslovakia over the pretext of protecting the Germans who were being ostracized by the Czechs or the Slovaks. Thereafter, you would again know that the Second World War starts with Poland. Poland was a country which was created via taking half of the area from the USSR and half of the area from Germany. So as it is, it had a border dispute with Germany previously, what are called the Locarno honeymoons at that point of time. Locarno did not basically resolve this boundary issue between Germany and Poland, and therefore Poland already had an issue with Germany, and Germany over the issue of Eastern Prussia, that we want a rail link, will start to pressurize Poland. But at this point of time, Poland had an understanding with England that if there is any form of aggression, because Poland had already seen what had happened in Czechoslovakia, if there will be any form of aggression from the Germans, England is going to help Poland against this. And therefore, when on the 1st September 1939, there is the German invasion of Poland, on 2nd September, first Britain and then France is going to declare the war. That is the context in which the Second World War starts. That is the Polish occupation of Germany, and thereafter you have England, France starting the war. Initially, it is only the Germans, English, French, Poland sector which is at war, but this will start to mushroom further. Now, if you've ever gone through the basic phases of the Second World War, you would know Normandy is very late. Normandy is very, very late. That ways, there's a lot which had gone through Europe in that regard, and then comes Normandy. Now briefly, I'll try to explain to you why Normandy is considered so important, because you can't understand the 80th anniversary and the politics of Normandy without understanding how did the phases change. Now, you already know that September of 1939, you have the Polish defeat to the Germans, and Germans at this point of time were using a technique which nobody knew, which is called blitzkrieg. Blitzkrieg is basically lightning warfare, winning without fighting. Now the concept is, if you look at France, Britain or Germany, Germany was cut to its size and it had 10 times lower the numbers of soldiers which even France and Britain had at this point of time. So Germany could not afford, or Hitler could not afford, a long war. He wanted a quick war, and that is why this is called the war of attrition, where it was a war of production. The idea was Hitler wanted very quick warfare and he could not wait for long trench warfare, which was the characteristics in the First World War itself. Now, when Hitler devised an idea how to go about it, he devised the idea of blitzkrieg, which is rather than concentrating force on every point in the border, rather concentrate force only on one point. And therefore you use the Navy and the Air Force, Luftwaffe and the ground forces together to break open a point. Now France at this point of time started to go for wartime mobilization, but did not understand one thing, which is, and therein comes Normandy. Normandy is in France. The idea is France went for the old type Maginot Line based idea that we will hold on to trenches. But Hitler was in no position to do trench warfare. That is why he wanted mobile warfare with a lot of new technologies such as the radio and quick movement rather than slow movement. And therefore, it will not take a lot of time for Hitler from the January of 1940. By June of 1940, after he had taken Poland, Czechoslovakia and Austria, there's a period called phony war, which is everybody is now moving towards the west or the western side itself. Hitler is now going to move everything towards his western border itself. And now when it will come to the invasion of France, Hitler is going to do the same thing which the Germans did in the First World War, which is not to enter through the Maginot Line, but rather to enter from the Belgium and the Netherlands sector, the Dutch sector. And nobody had an answer for blitzkrieg at this point of time. So therefore, Germany was able to take Netherlands, Belgium and France very quickly. Hitler reached within 2 months of fighting to Paris, and France surrendered in the same carriage in which the Germans had surrendered in the First World War. Symbolically, we have multiple images of Hitler standing in front of the Eiffel Tower itself. And now, basically, when it comes to continental Europe is now under Germany. Germany has now already taken this sector. It has taken this sector also. It has taken Poland also. It has taken Slovakia, and now it was moving towards Hungary. And Italy and Germany are one axis. That is why the word Axis power itself. Now Hitler moves towards Great Britain, which is called the concept of Battle of Britain. As you can see here, Battle of Britain is Hitler's attempt to now take Britain. Britain somehow already had an advantage of being an island nation, but Battle of Britain is where the Western Front is going to become a stalemate, because the basic range of the Luftwaffe or the Air Force of Hitler was not more than 4,000 kilometers, and to go and come back from Britain, southern parts, you needed at least 2,500 to go and come back. So no bomber could go into the internal parts of Britain. So it could maximum go till this point. This is the point till which they could reach. After that, they can't reach. And that is why London was bombed day in, day night, but the British moved all of their critical equipment towards the north because the Germans could not reach. This is where Hitler is going to start to become a little bit more frustrated by the war, because now the war was getting prolonged. He was now fighting for 2 years. He had already taken France. Normandy has already been lost. Now, Battle of Britain, Britain will also give a lot of stiff resistance. A lot of bombers will be lost by Hitler. And Hitler will now reorient. And this is where we believe that the war now starts to change. Hitler thought that he will be able to take Germany, the whole European sector very quickly. But Battle of Britain is the first roadblock he hits. Now, he asks Italy to take Greece and the Egyptian sector so that the Suez Canal could be stopped. When the Italians reach Greece and Italy, they will lose to the very small and very ill-equipped, what we call as Greek and Egyptian forces. However, then Hitler would have to send, and that is where Hitler did not have a good ally, Hitler had to send troops to Greece and to Egypt, and therefore he will then take the Greek sector and stop the Suez Canal activities. So he is basically reoriented towards the Asian sector, because he is now in dire need of something which he did not predict, which is petroleum and resources. Because Germany is in a way now surrounded on both sides by enemy powers and the Western Front has become a problem, he has to look for oil, and that is where it becomes a war of attrition, a long war, who can produce more. And therein Hitler will do the first mistake, and his basic notions of socialism had already actually been shattered very quickly, was the idea of going for the USSR invasion, which is called Operation Barbarossa. Operation Barbarossa will start in June of 1941. Close to 5 lakh Nazi forces with a very strong armored division will enter the USSR. Hitler had predicted that USSR may have had maximum 10 million forces, but at this point of time Stalin had the largest army in the world with close to 3 to 4 crore, which is 30 to 40 million soldiers spread across the USSR itself. And by the first 2 to 3 months, the Germans had already captured 5 to 6 lakh USSR soldiers, and still there was a new wave coming in. There's a very important notion, and this point you should remember, because this will help you understand something where the internal politics today, the geopolitics today will be seen. It is believed that Stalin took the brunt of the Nazi forces. The Russian losses were very big, but Stalin that ways should be credited and was credited to actually slow down the Nazi army. One thing or a blunder which was done whilst all of this was happening was that Japan, trying to punch above its weight, is going to do Pearl Harbor, and once the Americans will enter after Pearl Harbor, the whole tide of the war will change. Now Hitler, though, was able to take the Ukrainian sector and get access to oil, Hitler was now not in a position to fight a very, very fresh, a totally new what we call as entry into the war, which is the Americans. The Americans had not properly got involved in this war till 1941, and now they will get involved. So the USSR and the Americans enter the war at the same point of time. That is the concept of this. See, here you can see the same point of time Soviet Union, same point of time Pearl Harbor. By end of 1941, USA and USSR have entered on the Allied side. Now the Axis offensive, which was actually very, very heavy, will reverse, and the reversal will start with first, which is called the Battle of Midway Islands. Under Battle of Midway Islands, the Japanese tried to again attack the Americans, but the Americans are going to very well manage that onslaught itself, and from this point Japanese will cease to be a threat to the Americans. But now it will be about liberating the sectors. So you have the first Battle of El Alamein. Battle of El Alamein is to take Greece and Egypt out of the Axis hands. Then comes the concept of Battle of Stalingrad, wherein more or less between 1941 to 43, it was clear that Operation Barbarossa was actually a failure, because he had gone for a three-pronged approach rather than going straight to Moscow. Hitler was now losing properly, and at the Battle of Stalingrad, Hitler will properly lose out to Stalin, and now the Germans will start to retreat from the USSR sector. It is in this context where you have to understand Normandy. Please understand Normandy in the larger context of how now they have already taken Greece, they've taken Egypt, the Allied forces have taken back, and they will also reach till Rome and take Italy. And therein lies the last hurrah, or you can say the last push to take France. Therein lies Normandy. Normandy is basically from the UK sector crossing the English Channel into the Normandy beaches, and then entering whatever you see as these boxes are basically the German forces, and these lines are the Allied movements in that regard. So they concentrated here because at this point of time most of the troops were far away. The German troops were far away. 1.5 lakh soldiers were brought into continental Europe via Normandy, and close to 20,000 different vehicles and 2,000 tanks were brought in by the Americans on the beaches of Normandy. That is why Battle of Normandy is considered very, very important. This will be the beginning of the end for Hitler, and after this you will have nothing but a two-pronged approach from USSR and the Americans and the British and the French to take Germany, and that will in turn lead to the surrender of Germany whilst Hitler is going to kill himself, and then the Americans are going to drop Hiroshima, Nagasaki, 2 atomic bombs to make Japan surrender. And on 2nd September 1939 this war started. On 2nd September 1945 this war will end. So Normandy is basically considered the 80 years, 6th June 1944 is considered the turning point. This is where now the Allied forces wanted to take continental Europe back. So whilst Hitler went first to Poland, then to France, Belgium, Netherlands, all this sector taken by him, then towards England. Then he changed his approach, going towards Egypt and then towards the what we call as Greek sector, then turning his attention towards USSR. The first mistake he did, second mistake done by Japan to make Americans enter the war, and thereafter first they will take Midway Islands, which is Pacific, then they will take Egypt, Greece back, then they will look towards taking France back. Therein lies the story of Normandy. This is basically the timeline. If you have any idea about the Second World War, this is basically the timeline from invasion of Germany of Poland to this is the Normandy story, Normandy invasion. This I have added to the PPT. You will get this PPT on the Telegram channel. You can like and subscribe to that also, so that you can use it for your basic what we call as revision. This is a very important topic for the GS paper 1 mains generally. Now comes the geopolitics. So what have I established? I've established that Normandy is a moment which basically represents the beginning of the end of Hitler. And basically when we look at the actors here, you have Germany, Italy, Japan versus Britain, France, which includes Belgium plus Dutch, and you have the USSR and the USA. Now, even before Normandy started, everybody was asking a question that what do we do with the concept of socialism? Because that question was very, very important. And the rivalry between the US and the USSR was already back by the end of Normandy vis-a-vis what is called as Cold War politics. What is called the Cold War politics, which is the proxy war between the two, capitalist and the socialist. Now, in this configuration, it is believed that Stalin did have a very important role. Russia did play a very important role in the larger story of the Second World War. Without Stalin, without USSR, the Nazis would not have become very, very weak, or the brunt and the losses at the level of the USSR was actually quite grave. It is believed that close to 40 to 50 lakh soldiers were either wounded or killed in the process of the Nazi invasion, Operation Barbarossa. Now, if I have to give credit, I will give credit to USSR, USA, France, Britain, all of them to basically say that the Allied powers were able to stop the Axis powers. That's a very simple, straightforward understanding. Now, today, so I'm now transitioning to the geopolitics of today. Ironically, the Normandy Memorial is going to be visited by Biden, which is the US, plus Macron, which is France. And we will have the representatives of Britain, Charles, the King himself is going. And thereafter, even the German Chancellor and the Italian Prime Minister is going to show what is called post-war reconciliation, that nobody has a grudge today, everybody is together. The European sector has matured enough to take everybody together. So nobody from Japan, as it is, they don't deserve to be there at this point of time. The idea is Germany, Italy represent the reconciliatory approach of the Cold War politics, and Britain, France and the Americans represent the victor powers. Now again in this you can see that at that point of time there was a very conscious attempt to downplay the role of Stalin of USSR in 1945. Same way Russian representatives have not been called. Now this is in the backdrop of the Russia and Ukraine crisis itself, and somehow this reminds me of a very important saying in history, which is the more the things change, they remain the same, which is that though we are sitting in 2024, somehow again the West versus Russian politics, the USSR politics and tension is back. Russia is to be blamed, wherein it has gone for an invasion of Ukraine itself, and it has its own ideas with regards to NATO, what is called as the Iron Curtain and Cold War 2.0. But there's a very interesting symbolism here. In this image, wherein the memorial itself is there, a lot of veterans are going to come. There's an erasing of, or there's a certain sanitization of this narrative that the Russians did nothing. And this is where geopolitics, history, world history all interact together. That today, when there will be the major condolences given to the families, and we will honor the soldiers who had laid their life to take back Europe, the idea is Russia is not there. And this is where you need to understand that the West versus Russia idea, the West versus Russia tensions have always been there. It became a little bit better, but today we are somehow back into that Cold War mentality where it is about removing Russia from the angle. So though this article is very straightforward, which talks about the concept of a critical moment, Biden trying to argue that we are the protectors of democracy, the US has not been a very responsible power itself, but the US won the Cold War in that larger context of proxy wars itself. The idea is Russia's what we call as sanitization, its erasure from this history is problematic. And though we have Russia being in the Ukraine war itself, the importance of Russia in the Second World War cannot be denied. This is the argument which I'm trying to argue here vis-a-vis the article itself. Russia played a very important role from this point till this point. USSR played a very important role to dampen the Nazi forces, and their contribution to the Second World War should not be ignored. Now, how will the UPSC ask a question out of this? You can get a very straightforward, simple question in the form of a mains question in GS paper 1. The Battle of Normandy marked the beginning of the end of the Axis onslaught on Europe. Elucidate. It's a very simple question, but needs a very important understanding of how Normandy is not just one battle, but it is related to the story of Midway Islands, Elimination, the story of the surrender of Italy itself, and the larger Operation Barbarossa and the USSR. You can get a modified question in GS paper 2 also, where they can talk about that because, and you should expect a question this year, because Battle of Normandy 80 years anniversary is there, you can get a very straightforward question there that how the current geopolitics is very close to, and there's a lot of similarity. This is where you have to develop an understanding. There's a lot of similarity in the politics which happened after the Second World War and what is happening today, which is that NATO versus the USSR, and now today NATO versus the Russian angle still remains. So though we believe that we have evolved as a global what we call as community, we can talk about reconciliation. Somehow Russia first was ostracized and targeted for socialistic ideas and the idea of socialism, Leninism, and now today it has its own problems with the West. Though Russia is to be blamed for its basic prerogative at this point of time, the idea is for you, the similarities and the mirror image of these two periods is important because UPSC can check, are you understanding it or not? So I hope that this article is good enough for you to understand this politics, and I've tried to give you a much more longer perspective, a holistic perspective of the Second World War, and I've tried to revise the static portion with you. So with this, let's move to the second article, which is from Christoph Jefferlot. He is a very interesting intellectual coming from King's College. He's talked about the elections, and this is not a solution-based article. There are two types of articles in the newspaper. One is solution giving, the other one is problem stating. This one is like trying to tell you that now there may be trends which may re-emerge in the Indian politics and in the Indian polity itself, which may have been going in the wrong direction previously. So, the roads to India's redemocratization, the challenges, in this article, totally based on his views, he has identified 3 problems which were there in the past decade, and 3 developments which could be critical and important in the larger story of the Indian political space and discourse. So, he has argued in the past 10 years, and this is his argument, in the past 10 years, there has been 3 tendencies which are quite problematic and counterfactual, and we can say counterproductive for democracy. The first was that with regards to federalism, which is center-state relationship and the relationship between the center and state, federalism, there was a lot of what we call as center, as it is we are a unitary bias country itself, but within the federalistic setup, the center was dictating too much with regards to even GST payout or the finances of it. Generally, because there was an absolute majority, there was a tendency for the center to be extremely controlling. So this was the first space he identifies where there was a problem, wherein maybe the previous governments would have been very controlling and centralized, would never took the states together. If there was a rival party in power, then there was no communication also. Second, what he talks about is state apparatus. And there has been a lot of talk about this with regards to how the governments use the state apparatus to target and even in a way dilute democracies in certain sectors, and therefore state apparatus and its role in the larger context is something which is very, very important. Then comes third, which is the issue of centralization. These two are connected to each other. Issue of centralization. When we talk about issue of centralization, there was a tendency to move alone without taking the federalistic partners together. Therein, these two add to each other, which is the centralization of power and federalistic tendencies being diluted via a unilateral decision-making approach in the larger context. And the state apparatus, state here does not mean the state, but state vis-a-vis the government itself, governmental apparatus. Herein lies where the tool which was used to either increase centralization or subvert federalism. Now, what he hopes, and this is Jefferlot's own understanding, that what he hopes is 3 things will happen with coalition era politics back. With this NDA coming to power, we are truly in the coalition era now, with the regional partners playing very, very important. Naidu and Nitish are going to play a very important role in the way this government is going to operate, even with portfolio distribution to basic politics itself. So his hope is that, and this is again an article which talks about a certain future which may be, but because UPSC can ask you the implications of this election in a certain way, we are trying to understand what Jefferlot is arguing. Now, he says that there can be 3 implications in the larger context. This is totally his understanding, and I'm trying to give a basic shape to his argument on how he's trying to argue with regards to what are the implications. The first implication is that with coalition politics back, one thing is going to happen for sure, which is federalism is going to strengthen, which is within center-state relationship, with regional parties having a major say in creating this government itself. The idea is the state's power will increase, and at least when it comes to a federation where center and state has to take decisions together. Previously, the center was taking this unilaterally. Now the state will have a say, because Nitish and Naidu and other alliance partners will make sure that the center cannot take an action which automatically has a certain implication, which was previously the case. So federalism would get strengthened in the larger context of coalition politics. So in a way, coalition politics, though it is always considered problematic or sometimes also associated with what we call as unstable governments, somehow in 2024, the revivalism of coalition politics is considered to be very, very important, because this way we have a strong opposition, and therefore when it comes to democracy, a strong opposition is important. And therein lies the second point which he makes, which is the use of state apparatus, which may include the ED, the CBI, the use of state apparatus, there will be moderation now. Because again, there is answerability to certain actors and powers. Therefore, the unilateral use of state apparatus will now be questioned, and there has to be moderation in this. At the same point of time, the third point he makes is that civil society and the concept of the opposition getting strengthened will in turn lead to the political discourse of India will change. Political discourse of India will change, wherein there will have to be some form of decentralization. There will have to be some form of decentralization, because if there is no decentralization, in turn it will lead to the NDA government or the government itself getting in a way jeopardized by its own state partners. So therefore, there will be a political discourse change. Though the decentralization may not be at the level of Vajpayee, the idea is, and as he says, that the political discourse will change, and in turn it will strengthen federalism. So the way he argued first was circular, which is federalism was in a way jeopardized because of centralization with the use of state apparatus. At the same point of time, the next 5 years, the implication of what we had as the election results will in turn lead to federalism, center-state relationship changing, in turn leading to civil society and opposition now getting a voice, changing the political discourse. With change in political discourse, federalism will change, and with federalism will change, there will be change in the use of state apparatus. This is basically his argument out of this article, where he is very hopeful, and you can say that there are challenges to redemocratization. But the question is, how can UPSC ask you a question vis-a-vis a certain article which has been given in the paper itself? Let's see that question. You see, the revival of coalition era politics in India holds potentiality to further democratize the Indian polity. Do you agree? Now here you can go either way. This type of question is quite realistic in GS paper 2, wherein they can ask you an opinion based question. You can go either way. It is saying that does coalition era politics have the potentiality to democratize Indian polity? If you want, you can go to the route which Jeffalot is taking, and there will be further articles about this also, wherein the idea that somehow coalition era politics previously may not have been having the same implications. Today in 2024, the point of coalition era politics getting revived would be that there is potentiality to redemocratize, which is there will be further strengthening of federalism, the concept of state apparatus moderate use, further the political discourse is going to change. You can go the other way around also, which is you can also argue, and if it was critically analyzed, then you would have to give it. The other way you could go and say that coalition era politics previously has also existed. It leads to a certain tendency where there comes policy paralysis because there are too many actors, and in turn decisive leadership is somehow undercut. Now that is totally your prerogative. You have to look at the tone of the question. Here the tone of the question is extremely neutral. It's extremely neutral, but because it is asking you to do you agree, the examiner is asking you what line I have given as an examiner. Is it right or not? Is it right or not? Basically, this is a statement made by the examiner. Do you want to agree with him or not? Here you would have to take a middle path. As a UPSC aspirant, you have to make sure that you're writing neutral answers. Neither spectrum you are choosing. You are the future civil servant of this India. You will serve the public. The public does not have a secondary identity. You have to understand that serving Indians means you have to have a neutral approach, and being a part of the government of India, this is your aspiration. So therefore you have to take a certain approach where you are balancing the acts. You have to balance this question. Don't go to the total extreme of saying that coalition politics is basically instability, and don't go to the other extreme of saying that there was no democracy in India itself. That is where you have to balance this question. So I hope again this article is truly and completely clear to you. Now, we move to GS paper 3 and a very interesting article on air pollution. Now see, air pollution is talked about quite a lot. We all know that. Air pollution, PM 2.5, particulate matter 2.5, particulate matter 10, these are always in the news. We have greenhouse gas issues with regards to the CO2 emission, we have nitrogen issues, we have multiple what we call as gases and particulate matter which contribute to air pollution. That part is already something which you would know or have idea about. Air pollution in India specifically is a big problem, not just about the greenhouse gas emissions and the amount of sulfur, nitrogen or carbon dioxide in the atmosphere itself, or even in the ground level, what we call as air, further the ozone concentration. But the question is, what is actually doing damage to you and me, for example in Delhi or even in metro cities, is particulate matter 2.5 and 10. Particulate matter 2.5 is more dangerous because of its smaller size, and it penetrates into our lungs and into our airways and has tangible impacts. A lot of people who had no history of asthma or what we call as airborne diseases have now developed airborne diseases in Delhi, in multiple parts of North India, and all metros face this issue. Now when we talk about air pollution, see, air is in front of me right now, is in front of you itself. It is an invisible thing, which is that there's an invisibility to air pollution. This is the very interesting argument, which is the concept of invisibility to air pollution. When we talk about air, there's an invisibility to it. So, for example, if you talk about water pollution, there's a tangibility to it, there's a visibility to it, because you can see what we call as fresh water being very, very pristine, clear, and you can see contaminated water. So there is, through your eyes, you can see that water is contaminated, and that has a more impact on you. It is believed that visual impulses have more psychological impact than just other sensory impulses. So water, I can see directly that there is differentiation. Even in soil, when it comes to soil pollution, I can look at the soil and I have certain visibility with regards to pollution. I can see soil erosion also, I can see water pollution also. But when it comes to air pollution, there's a certain invisibility to it. Okay, particulate 2.5 is above 300, above 500, you would have seen the AQI levels. For us, they are just numbers. There's no visibility to it. Therefore, in that context, the air of the Anthropocene initiative has been launched. This is a collaboration between the authorities which are related to air pollution and artists. So the air of the Anthropocene initiative is basically an initiative to give visibility to air pollution. And that ways, it is a very interesting collaboration. Now, what have they done? What they've done is using very simple AQI machines, air quality index machines, and what is called as LED arrays. LED arrays means that basically a big transparent sheet of array, or a certain transparent sheet on which small LED lights are there. They have tried to give visibility to air pollution. I'll try to show it to you, you will understand. See, this is how they're trying to represent air pollution. They have taken example, for example, this is Palampur and this is Delhi. They have tried to show that the small dots which you see here are the representation of PM 2.5. PM 2.5 concentration, they have tried to show between Delhi and Palampur. And what you can see here is that the density of PM 2.5 in Palampur and Delhi, there's a major differentiation. 12.5 times more concentration is there in Delhi than in Palampur. Now, for you and me, this would not be visible, that I can see the difference between the air in Palampur and the air in Delhi. They have done this study for Delhi, UK, Ethiopia, and they have tried to show that this is a street in Delhi in the night with 500 to 600 AQI vis-a-vis the density of PM 2.5 in the air in the night in Delhi when it read 500 to 600 in that, it looks something like this. Now imagine how you are breathing this air. We can't see it. This is the air you are breathing in Delhi, wherein every small LED, this is real-time projected, the AQI machine is linked to LEDs, every LED lights up on the basic density parameters which have been given. Imagine this is the air in Delhi itself. If this is made at the scale of Delhi itself, every inch of Delhi would have more than 10 to 15,000 such small LEDs. Inch. And therefore, this is where this whole initiative is very interesting. It has also done one study in Ethiopia, wherein in Ethiopia, a house which was using biomass as a way of producing the food had 20 times more particulate matter than any other household which was using gas. This initiative, an artistic initiative in itself, has a very important impact. See, the artists are not claiming that this will have a scientific impact. This is where the psychological impact comes in. Because air, water pollution, soil pollution, any other form of pollution you can see, you tend to be conscious about it. Air pollution, which is the air you are breathing in and destroying your lungs, is something which you do every day, every minute, every second of your life, and we don't actually check what is the quality, and we can't see it, so therefore we don't care. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to give tangibility, visibility to a air pollution concept using technology and artistic expression. And as the artist said, this has no scientific basis. It's not about scientific basis, it's about what we call as a certain psychological impact. This will make us more aware. What is the impact of this? The impact of this, which is more important for UPSC aspirant, is awareness. This will in turn lead to us to develop a certain new awareness about the concept of air pollution, because now the civil society, the local communities, all of them can now have a physical manifestation of this issue. And further, it then also should have a certain policy impact. Policy impact, because now the climate deniers, the people who talk about air pollution dismissively, and there is a big lobby within politics all across the world who say that air pollution is non-existent. I can't see it. What is the issue? And the idea that the global south needs to work even more, because the AQI levels between London and Delhi are significantly different. The global south has to work much more towards the concept of awareness, and it is for you and me. For you and me, we are caught up in our own lives. We tend to ignore air pollution. And therefore, this is what you are breathing in Delhi, in most of the metros. Imagine standing here, an amount of air you are taking in every breath. The particulate matter is going inside your lungs and in turn causing damage and creating context for airborne diseases. So, how can UPSC articulate this as a question in the examination? Let's see how it can come in the exam. Very simple, straightforward question, but interesting that way. The fight against air pollution is both a scientific and psychological one. Elucidate. This question may be a very interesting way of asking about air pollution, because it is saying that the fight against air pollution is scientific. Sure, we have indicators, we have AQI levels, we have machines which try to figure it out. We have all of that. That makes a lot of sense. Sure, we talk about the way we need to mitigate it, no stop stubble burning, this, that, upper air circulation, okay. But there's also a psychological angle to it. And the psychological angle to it is that if we don't create awareness and actually show the tangibility of air pollution and air, what we call as contamination, then it makes no sense. So the word elucidate here means that you have to demonstrate. In explain, you have to explain, but in elucidate, demonstrate, substantiate, you have to give through examples, tell us. So here you can just basically talk about how water pollution, soil pollution people are more aware about because through the idea of visibility. Air pollution, people are aware, but they don't take it seriously because there's invisibility to it. Yes, the fight against air pollution has to be scientific through interventions. At the same point of time, it also has to take into account the grassroots level, moving away from biomass, moving away from traditional sources of fuel. That may be for some people just a random move, but if you can show to the community that, see, this is the difference between using gas and biomass, there will be behavioral change. And with behavioral change, there will be psychological change. And with psychological change, all these scientific methods will become even more effective. So a very interesting case of giving visibility to something which is invisible. With this, let's move to the next topic, which is India's fight against TB. Now, what is tuberculosis? Tuberculosis is an airborne disease. Mycobacterium tuberculosis is the name of the bacteria, which basically spreads through airborne particles itself. But what is problematic about TB is that it can start at a certain space, it can become dormant, and it can impact bone. You can have bone TB, you can have what is called as bone marrow TB, you can have even TB in the brain, plus in the what we call as nephrology, which is the what we call as the excreting system, or what we call as the urinary tract itself. So the concept is you have kidney, it can impact kidney, it can impact the brain, it can impact bone, it can impact spinal cord, multiple places. It can start from lung but can go further into different spaces. Further, the symptoms are standard, which is cough, fever, weight loss. But the good thing about, there's nothing good about TB, but a saving grace about TB is because it is a bacterial infection, it can be cured. It is 100% curable with a proper regime, and the basic prerogative for TB, what we call as diagnosis and cure, is that you should never leave the TB medicine in between. So if you start in January and they say that you have to eat till October, and the doctor has given certain medicines, you have to eat those medicines irrespective of anything, because if you leave the medication in between, the TB bacteria in your body is going to become resistant to the concept of that antibiotic, and therefore the problem with TB is that TB very quickly can become what is called as MDR TB and then XDR TB, which is multi-drug resistant TB and then extremely resistant form of TB, wherein you have used the first line of defense with antibiotics, it did not work, you left the course, so you basically have created resistance in your body. Antibiotic resistance itself is a very, very big problem which is emerging in India, and then it becomes MDR. MDR, then the drugs don't apply on the TB itself, in turn it becomes XDR. So therefore TB that way is not a very dangerous disease, but the problem is its diagnosis and its course is expensive, it is painful and needs a lot of willpower. And because the impact of the medicines itself is actually quite a lot on the body, you can get jaundice, you can also have a lot of nauseating feeling, vomiting, it impacts you quite a lot. People tend to leave it in between. Now the question which is being raised in this article is that India has argued that it will end all forms of TB in India by 2025. So TB Mukt Bharat, or the concept of elimination of TB, zero TB by 2025. However, though initially there was good progress in the numbers and it went down, the problem is it has now plateaued. The number of TB cases had reached its peak and were now going down, but now it has plateaued. It is not changing the way it should be, and therefore two things have to change. Firstly, this plateauing means that the number of TB patients are not going down. Close to 4,80,000 people annually die because of TB, because of either undiagnosed, not properly treated, or just because they did not have any idea how to go about it and the money which is involved here. Plus, if I bring this down to from here, 1400 people every day die of TB, which should not be the case. See, viral diseases, we understand that viral antibiotics are not going to work. There is already a proper regime set for TB. So some people don't have access. The people who have access either leave it because of financial constraints, or they just basically don't have the willpower to do it because of the impacts, because the mitigation of the treatment is not very good, either again because of economics or the hospital itself. And there's also one more story, which is called the 1 million, 10 lakh, 1 million missing cases of TB, which is that either they were diagnosed, but there's no record on how the treatment went. Either they're totally undiagnosed. Somebody was treating you for something else, but it was TB. And there is also a case that people are going to private hospitals and the government does not have that data. So the idea is that there is a very curious case of missing TB cases, plus TB, the fight against TB has plateaued, and therein the health department, the health ministry has now argued that we need to change our approach. We need to relook, reimagine, and need to change our protocols on how do we tackle it. We have better technology today to detect it. We have better medicines, but the problem is, how does the government look at its hospital in the larger context, and how do we mitigate it and how do we track it is more important. So the load of TB is actually quite big. It's quite big, though being a bacterial infection. The concept is, it is either putting people into poverty or it is inducing them to go towards poverty itself. But what is more important is that we need to change the protocols. This is a very important point. Reworking the protocols is something more important, because if we are going on the same track, we have already plateaued the number. There is no way we are going to go down in the numbers and eliminate by 2025 if we don't relook. Now, the article does not say how do we relook, or how do we rework, or how do we change. But for you, it is important because there can be a question in the examination. So I have certain points which have been collated from multiple sources. The first one is very simply awareness. There needs to be the awareness of TB even more, that TB can be cured. TB, people also link it up with social ostracization. See, not all forms of TB are lung TB, which is, yes, if there's lung TB, it can be spread through what is called dhamma. It can be spread through coughing, and then the people have to take care around, and the TB patient in that way is dangerous. That is not the only case of TB. In bone TB, in what we call as pancreatic and even nephrology based TB or bone marrow, there's no communication. It is just in the bone marrow or in the bone, and therefore it cannot be communicated through airborne. It has nothing to do with lungs. The idea is it was dormant in the body, it became active. But the problem is that people don't know that it is only the TB which is impacted or which is impacting the lung which is dangerous. It is not the other ones, or the people basically have a social stigma related to that I have now TB. And therefore they either get totally ejected out of the society itself, or the society itself rejects it. So there needs to be the awareness to the patient that what type of TB do you have, and are you a certain threat to others. At the same point of time, in either case, the patient should know that it is curable. They only have to go through the course. And to the society, we need to tell us, or we have to create a certain space in which they should understand that TB does not always kill vis-a-vis through other forms of what we call as subdued or subsided forms of TB in that regard. Not all forms of TB are dangerous if the patient itself is not dangerous, if it is other than lung. And more than that, you also need to understand that if we start to eject these people, we don't take care of these people, as it is, they will become more or less demoralized. It's a psychological thing that you are basically now socially ostracized, you are discriminated against. That is something which needs to be removed. So first is reworking of the protocols, but is reworking of the awareness campaign also. Second is using technology as much as possible. See, we still are using old forms of tests, brucella and multiple other x-rays to basically come up with the idea that TB is there or not. There's a lot of misdiagnosis. Sometimes people dismiss TB as just being cough and cold, and the idea is when it becomes too heavy or the bacterial load becomes too heavy, then people talk about TB. The technology which we have as of right now, even available very cheaply today, there can be much quicker diagnosis and there can be much better care of the patient. Third is that the government needs to step up its regime. Regime means how do we diagnose it? How do we care for the patient? How do the medicines are made accessible to the patient itself? And therefore, how do we treat the patient? Just giving the medicines to the patient is not going to be enough, because there are multiple complications which develop within the tuberculosis treatment itself, and therefore you need very close care. Further, because weight loss is one of the most important symptoms of TB, the idea is that we also need to make sure that there is dietary care. We have multiple schemes. 500 rupees per month is given to every TB patient if registered with the government for dietary care. But let's be very honest, the government can't give more, but 500 in today's world is not too much. So we need to make sure that either we have government specialized hospitals in which TB care is made either free or is subsidized in that regard. The medicines are cheap but need to be accessible in certain parts of India itself, and XDR and MDR TB need to be taken into consideration more. So it is technology, it is governmental intervention, it is awareness. Now, where do you use this form of narrative and ideas? If you get a question like this, for example, there is a need to rework and reimagine India's fight against TB. Discuss 150 words. Very good question for GS paper 3. You have to come up with these ideas. But how does the current affairs get linked to it? In the introduction, obviously you would have to talk about this report that 4,80,000 people are still dying a year because of TB, 1,400 per day, and there is a plateauing of the TB elimination from India itself, and the target of 2025 is not looking realistic as of right now. How do you rework? Then you can talk about these points which I've given you here: awareness, technology, government, regime. So again, a very simple, straightforward article, but gives us a very good chance to understand what we call as the concept of TB itself. How do we tackle it? How do we mitigate it? These are very simple but very critical questions for the examination. Now we move to another implication of the elections. Small article but very interesting one. See, with coalition politics coming back, this is a very important concept itself. With coalition politics coming back, India is in negotiations with 4 countries or 4 zones: the UK, Oman, Australia and the EU. India is, as of right now, in talks with UK, Oman, Australia and EU with regards to free trade agreements. And this was a project of the previous government, and under these free trade agreements there were multiple sticking points, and one of the biggest sticking point here was labor laws, which is the EU and the UK were asking for further dilution of labor laws in that sense, and more accessibility specifically in the agricultural zone. They wanted reduction of subsidy in agriculture and more access to the agricultural sector of India. Now what the article points out, written by a professor himself, says that when you have absolute majority, and a very interesting analogy he's giving, when you have absolute majority, there is a tendency that you are going to liberalize the economy, and you have more discretion, you have more decision making power, and therefore with more discretion you will tend to basically liberalize the economy if you want to. If the government does not want to, separate issue altogether. But what is given as a very interesting concept is that if the tendency is of a coalition politics. Historically, coalition governments tend to be more protectionist. Protectionist. What do you mean by protectionist? Protectionist means that they tend to close the economy. They tend to close the economy. What do you mean by closing the economy? Because in a coalition government, there would be one party and it will be constellation of parties around it. You would have to look for the domestic constituency more. You would have more state in factors more, and therein you will tend to move towards protectionism, which is closing the economy, either tariff barriers, or you would not agree to a lot of things which you were agreeing previously. So what the article is saying is that with 4 FTAs in question and coalition politics generally leading to the concept of what we call as protectionism or protectionist policies itself, there is a tendency that maybe all these FTAs will get impacted. Now, he has given examples also. He has argued that, for example, if the NDA as of right now, we go with the configuration as of right now, Chandrababu Naidu may want the FTAs to go through and also have a more liberal approach towards these FTAs, specifically the EU and the UK one, because the EU and the UK one is the more problematic one because there is agricultural access, more investment opportunity, but dilution of labor laws which is being asked about. So Chandrababu Naidu may be pro FTA. However, people are saying, and his argument is, this is not me but him, who's saying that Nitish may not want these FTAs because they impact agriculture sector. And because agriculture sector is a bigger important sector for Nitish's constituency, he may oppose these FTAs. Further, because if you go by the vote share analysis itself, in rural India there has been a change in vote share for the BJP itself. And therefore, there can be a certain realization that we are taking the rural India for granted, and therefore there could be a more farmers-based approach. If it's a farmers approach, then these free trade agreements with UK and EU will not go through. The argument again given in the last part of this article is most probably they will go through, there will be delays. However, now the politics of India will impact how the trade agenda is created. That is what it says. Trade partners await new government trade agenda. The old government agenda was liberalization, opening up, and they could do it unilaterally because even if opposed in the parliament, either they were expelled or they were subverted or nobody cared. It's an absolute majority. But with now regional partners in the mix, there will be a chance that either the FTAs will either be delayed or modified. At the same point of time, Nitish has an agricultural angle, Chandrababu Naidu has a certain industrial angle, and there could be internal politics. And therefore, this could be a very interesting foresight to something which is coming later. Let us see how it goes. But it tells you how one small change in Indian geopolitics has a resounding impact all across in different sectors. Okay. Let's move to the second last article. That article is because it is generally suggestive. I'm not giving you a question. You could get a question if something substantial happens. So let's not discuss that question as of right now. Now, in China and in the US, a joint program, a very rare collaboration that was, a joint program was running, and very recently, 5 children with hearing disabilities have now been cured via gene therapy. Now, the first question itself becomes, what is gene therapy? Now, when we talk about gene therapy is a genetic-based methodology or a technique in which genes are altered to either cure for an existing disease or correct for a certain gene problem in the body itself. So we all have genes, we have genetics, we have the chromosomes itself, and you have the CRISPR-C9, what we call as technique of basically changing genes itself. And because of certain lack of or either excess of genes, you can have either genetic diseases, autoimmune diseases, and diseases which may have manifest later. A very good example, I'll give you an example, a very good example of gene therapy is, for example, what is called a 3-parent baby, wherein, for example, the father has no issues and his DNA can be taken. However, the mother has certain issues with regards to DNA. She has a DNA in which the genetics are such that the child has a certain tendency to develop a genetic disease because of a certain problem. So what will be done is that there will be the third mother who will be born in, the donor mother, and her mitochondrial DNA, you have DNA in two spaces, in the cell itself but also in the mitochondria. Her mitochondrial DNA will be taken, and then all three will be added together, and the defective space where this mother had a mitochondrial DNA disease, the mitochondrial DNA of this mother will be added, and then the baby is going to be conceived. Now, this baby therefore has 3 genes. It has the gene of the father, it has the genetic material of the mother, but also the mitochondrial DNA of the other mother, which is, this is the biological mother, this is the donor mother. This is wherein basically they could see that this mother will not be able to conceive, or she has a problem because of mitochondrial DNA issues, and therefore they have substituted it. So it's a very standard thing which has now become very common. The UK was the first to experiment with this. 3-parent baby is a very good example of gene therapy. Gene therapy can also be in 2 ways. It can be done in 2 ways. One is called gene silencing and gene correction. Gene silencing is that there is an existing gene which needs to be silenced so that the genetic disease goes away, or there's a existing issue in the gene and you basically correct it. Therefore, gene silencing and gene correction is very common. It's a very elaborate concept. From anemia to cancer to different spaces, you can use gene therapy. Gene therapy is basically using genes, inducing genes, correcting genes, silencing genes through certain methodologies in order to treat for existing concepts or silence what is already there. So, what is the context of the 5 children? See, all of these 5 children had a specific genetic disease which is called OTOF gene issue. This was a genetic disease under which basically they don't produce a protein in their ear which is called otopharin, and otopharin, if it is not produced, you cannot hear. So all of us produce it in our inner ear automatically, and therefore we don't have any genetic issues. But these 5 children had a genetic problem wherein otopharin was not produced. So under this new gene therapy, they insert a modified virus which basically goes and impacts the cells of the inner ear and make them produce a proxy of otopharin. So they make a new version of otopharin gene, which in turn leads to hearing coming back. This is revolutionary that ways, because that ways we could be able to alter maybe the genes of the eyes, the ears, or even in the larynx, so as to bring back the ability to speak, listen, or hear. And the idea is this is revolutionary in the larger context. So this has now been only done on 5 children. If it goes for further clinical trials and it becomes standard, gene therapy may become the new revolutionary technology which could change birth-based disabilities, and that way it is quite interesting and important. Now you can get a prelims question from this area, and let's try to practice that. Consider the following statements. Gene therapy is a technique of altering the genetic material of cells to treat or prevent diseases. CRISPR is one of the methods of gene correction. Gene correction as a method of this therapy can only be done at the antenatal stage. Which of the following statements are correct? I give you 30 seconds or 20 seconds. Look at this question, come up with the answer. Is it only one statement is correct, only 2 statements are correct, all statements are correct, or none of the statements are correct? So first statement, simply correct. Yes, gene therapy is a technique to alter genetic material of cells to treat and prevent diseases. Is CRISPR a method? Yes, we just talked about it. But Third statement, you need to know two things. What does antenatal mean? And thereafter, is it true or not? Antenatal would mean during pregnancy, which is before the child is born, antenatal. Can gene correction only be done before birth and not after birth? This is incorrect statement. We can see gene correction has been done in this context after birth, and therefore gene correction can be postnatal also, antenatal also, and therefore only two statements are correct in this concept. With this, let's move to the last very simple topic. You should know his name. His name is Olga Kononenko. Kononenko has now spent 1,000 days in the International Space Station in space, and he's become the first such human to do it, and he's the first person to spend 1,000 days in space, and that way it's a milestone for the Russian cosmonaut. This is the only thing you need to know here. His name can come in the examination. You should generally know it. With this, I would like to now just discuss one small thing and we can end the session. I want to discuss the prelims mock test, which is going to happen on 9 June. Remember, this is the last test, the last dress rehearsal before you go for the examination on 16th. If you are not preparing for this year, you should still give these examinations, because this will help you practice and get to know what is the level of the questions. So we'll have this test on 9th June. We'll be there on 10th again with the discussion with regards to how to approach this paper. And I hope that you've been part of this series previously. All the tests before this are available. All the links are given in the description box. This PPT will be available on Telegram. And remember, 24,999 is the offer price as of right now. You will never get it at this price, and you should become a part of Unacademy if you believe that we constructively contribute in your UPSC journey. Thank you. See you tomorrow with another set of issues. Take care, and I hope that the discussion has been holistic enough, and do practice these questions. You can always write the answers in the comment box. We'll be happy to evaluate it. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.